Picture this. A man is drowning in mud. Not water, mud. The thick, corpse-fed sludge of a siege trench has swallowed him to the chest, and every desperate thrash pulls him deeper. His fingers claw at wooden planks that splinter under his grip. His mouth opens to scream, but the rain drives in, fills his throat, turns his voice to a gurgle. 20 feet away, his fellow soldiers keep digging. They don't look back. They've learned not to. The mud has already taken 3 men this week. The walls above them, massive, Ottoman-built, stained black with cannon smoke, watch in silence. Somewhere behind those walls, a muezzin calls the faithful to prayer. The drowning man hears it. It's the last thing he hears. The trench fills with rain. The body sinks. By morning, someone will dig through that same spot and find nothing but a helmet, half crushed, still warm from the skull that wore it. This is not how wars are supposed to be won. This is Hungary, 1595. The 16th century is bleeding out across Central Europe, and the wound is called Esztergom. Once, this city was the crown of the Hungarian kingdom, seat of archbishops, birthplace of kings, the place where St. Stephen himself was crowned. For 62 years, the Ottoman Empire has held it like a fist around a throat. 62 years of Turkish garrison, Turkish law, Turkish minarets rising where church spires once stood. Now, a Christian army has come to take it back. They call it liberation. They call it holy war. They call it the Long Turkish War, as if naming the nightmare makes it easier to survive. The man leading this army is Karl von Mansfeld, a German count with a reputation for brutality and a body already failing him. He is 52 years old. Gout has swollen his joints to the point where he cannot mount a horse without 2 men lifting him into the saddle. His kidneys are failing. His physicians have told him privately that he will not survive another winter campaign. He has told no one. He doesn't need to. The soldiers can see it in the way he moves. Stiff, careful, like a man carrying something broken inside him that might shatter with the wrong step. Mansfeld has assembled 40,000 men from across the Habsburg Empire. Germans, Hungarians, Italians, Wallachians, Transylvanians, Catholics who despise Protestants, Protestants who despise Catholics, Hungarians who despise Germans, Germans who despise everyone. They have one thing in common. They all hate the Turks more than they hate each other. For now, the siege has been grinding for weeks. The walls of Esztergom are not ordinary walls. The Ottomans have spent 6 decades reinforcing them, layering stone over stone, building bastions at angles that turn artillery fire into geometry problems, digging trenches and counter-trenches until the approaches look like the web of a deranged spider. The city sits on a hill above the Danube, and the river protects its northern flank like a moat of grey, churning water. The southern approach is the only viable attack route, and the Ottomans know it. They've made it a killing ground. Every assault costs lives. Every night the trenches fill with rainwater, and every morning men are found floating face down, too exhausted to keep their heads above the rising flood. The cannons fire day and night, but the walls absorb the punishment like flesh absorbs a beating, bruised, cracked, but somehow still standing. Historians still debate whether Mansfeld knew what he was truly facing when he began the siege. The Ottoman garrison inside numbered only 2,000 men, a skeleton crew, barely enough to man the walls. But those 2,000 were veterans of 100 skirmishes, commanded by a man named Koka Sinan Pasha, whose name meant the Great Architect, and who had built his reputation on defence, not attack. He had food for 3 months, he had powder for 10,000 shots, and he had something Mansfeld did not, the certainty that relief would come, because the Ottoman Empire did not abandon its fortresses, not ever. Not when the fortress was Esztergom, the gateway to Vienna, the hinge upon which the entire Hungarian front turned. Somewhere to the south, a relief army was already forming. Mansfeld could feel it like a pressure behind his eyes, a clock ticking in a language he couldn't quite read. The siege would be won or lost in weeks. If the walls didn't fall before the relief army arrived, 40,000 Christian soldiers would be caught between the fortress and the Ottoman field army. It would not be a battle, it would be an annihilation. And so the men kept digging, the trenches kept flooding, the mud kept swallowing the slow and the unlucky, and above it all those black walls waited, patient as death, silent as the graves being dug beneath them. What does it cost to take a city that doesn't want to be taken? The answer was written in blood, in mud, in the screams of men drowning in darkness. and it was only beginning. The smell hit you before the city did. Travellers approaching Esztergom from the south reported it first. A thick, sweetish rot that clung to the back of the throat and wouldn't wash out. Not with water, not with wine, not with prayer. It was the smell of a garrison dying by inches. Dysentery had hollowed out the Ottoman defenders months before the Christian army arrived. Men squatted in corners of the fortress, voiding themselves until there was nothing left but blood and bile. The latrines had overflowed in July. By August, the entire lower city smelled like an open grave. Köke Sinan Pasha walked the walls each morning, counting the men still standing. The number dropped daily. 1,400, 1,300, 1,200. The arithmetic was simple and merciless. At this rate, he would run out of defenders before he ran out of walls. But Sinan Pasha had not survived 40 years of Ottoman warfare by surrendering to arithmetic. He had other weapons: patience, deception, and the certain knowledge that his enemies were even more divided than his garrison was weak. He had studied the Christian coalition with the cold attention of a physician, examining a dying patient. 40,000 men, yes, but 40,000 men who could barely stand to share a campfire. The Germans looked down on the Hungarians as half-civilized frontier rabble. The Hungarians despised the Germans as foreign occupiers no better than the Turks. The Italians trusted no one. The Transylvanians, under their Prince Sigismund Bathory, had their own agenda, one that might not include actually taking the fortress at all. Sinan Pasha's spies reported everything. They told him about the arguments in the Christian command tent, the shouting matches between Mansfeld and the Hungarian captains, the near duel between a German artillery commander and an Italian engineer over whose cannon would fire first. They told him about the supply wagons that arrived half empty, the powder that turned out to be damp, the desertion rate that climbed every time the rain started, and the rain. The endless, miserable September rain. It had started 3 days after the siege began and hadn't stopped since. The Danube swelled until it threatened to flood the Christian camp. The siege trenches became canals. Men lived in water up to their ankles, their boots rotting off their feet, their skin turning white and soft as boiled meat. Fever swept through the ranks, not the dramatic, screaming fever of plague, but the slow, grinding fever of men whose bodies were simply giving up. Historians still debate whether the Ottoman garrison's weakness was a calculated deception or genuine desperation. Some accounts suggest Sinan Pasha deliberately let deserters escape, feeding them false information about how few defenders remained. These deserters would reach the Christian camp and report that the walls were barely manned, that one more assault would break through, and then the assault would come, and the Christians would find the walls fully manned, the defenders ready, the killing ground prepared. Other accounts paint a grimmer picture. The garrison was genuinely dying. The dysentery was real, the fever was real, the men vomiting blood in the corner of the mosque-turned-hospital were not acting. Sinan Pasha was simply making the best of catastrophe, turning his weakness into a weapon by making the Christians overcommit to attacks that cost them more than they cost him. The truth, as always in war, was probably both. What was not debatable was this. Every day the siege continued, both sides rotted a little more. The Christians lost men to mud and fever, and the occasional Ottoman sortie, nighttime raids where Turkish soldiers slipped out through hidden posterns, cut throats in the trenches and vanished before dawn. The Ottomans lost men to disease and despair, and the slow, grinding knowledge that no relief had yet appeared on the horizon. The walls held. That was what mattered. Stone and mortar and 60 years of Ottoman engineering held against German cannons and Hungarian fury, and the sheer, bloody-minded persistence of men who had nowhere else to go. But walls are not eternal. Nothing built by human hands is eternal. In the third week of September, a German engineer named Lazarus von Schwendi, nephew of the famous military reformer, reported to Mansfeld's tent with news that changed everything. His sappers had been digging for 11 days. They had tunnelled beneath the southeastern bastion, shoring up the passage with timbers stolen from demolished farmhouses. They had packed the end of the tunnel with 800 pounds of gunpowder. The mine was ready. Mansfeld received the news in silence. His face, witnesses reported, showed nothing. Not triumph, not relief, not even the grim satisfaction of a commander about to break a siege. He simply nodded, dismissed the engineer and sat alone in his tent for an hour. What he thought during that hour, no one knows. Perhaps he was calculating casualties. Perhaps he was praying. Perhaps he was simply trying to remember what it felt like to believe that victory meant something more than survival. The assault was scheduled for dawn, September 29th, the feast of St. Michael, the archangel who cast Satan from heaven. Mansfeld appreciated the symbolism. He suspected God did not. The night before the assault, the rain finally stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the storm had been. Men lay awake in their tents, listening to nothing, waiting for the sound of trumpets that would send them into the breach. Some of them wrote letters, most did not. There was nothing left to say. 3 months earlier, in the marble corridors of Vienna, a different kind of war was being fought. Archduke Matthias had summoned his commanders to a council of war, and the council had immediately devolved into a council of accusations. The long table in the Hofburg's war chamber held 14 men, and not one of them trusted the man sitting across from him. Maps lay unrolled between them, weighted down with wine goblets and sword hilts, showing the Ottoman frontier in painful detail. Red pins marked the fortresses that had fallen. There were too many red pins. The war, this long Turkish war that would eventually kill 300,000 men, had begun 2 years earlier with optimism and ended its first campaign in disaster. The Habsburgs had lost fortress after fortress. Győr, the great stronghold guarding the approaches to Vienna, had fallen in 1594. The commander who lost it, Ferdinand von Hardegg, had been executed for cowardice, dragged from his cell and beheaded in the courtyard of the very palace where Matthias now sat today. His blood had stained the cobblestones for weeks. That execution hung over every man in the room. It was meant to. Mansfeld spoke first because Mansfeld always spoke first. His voice was hoarse, damaged by decades of shouting over cannon fire, and it cut through the murmuring like a blade through silk. We take Esztergom, or we lose the war. There is no middle path. The Hungarian lords bristled. Count Miklos Palfi, whose family had bled for this frontier for 3 generations, slammed his palm on the table. You speak of Esztergom as if it were some German village. That city was ours before your grandfather learned to read. We will take it, but we will take it our way. Your way has lost us half of Hungary. The room went cold. Hands moved towards sword hilts. For a long moment the only sound was breathing. Fast, angry, dangerous. Matthias intervened with the weary expertise of a man who had refereed 100 such moments. Gentlemen, the Turk is the enemy, not each other. He paused, letting the obvious lie settle. Not yet. The compromise that emerged from that council was less a strategy than a controlled explosion. Mansfeld would command the siege, but Hungarian troops would hold the right flank, maintaining their autonomy under Palfi. Transylvanian forces under Sigismund Bathory would guard the southern approaches, theoretically preventing Ottoman relief forces from arriving. Italian mercenaries under Alfonso d'Este would man the artillery. German infantry would lead the assaults. It was a recipe for disaster. Everyone in the room knew it. The only question was which disaster would strike first. And historians still debate whether Matthias believed the coalition could actually function, or whether he simply needed a siege, any siege, to distract from the political crisis consuming his court. His brother, Emperor Rudolf II, had retreated into increasing madness in Prague, obsessing over astrology and alchemy while the empire crumbled. Matthias was manoeuvring to replace him, and a military victory would strengthen his hand enormously. If 40,000 men had to die to give him that victory, he considered it an acceptable price. The men themselves, of course, were not consulted about the price. They marched from Vienna in July, a column of soldiers and supply wagons and camp followers that stretched for miles along the Danube road. The heat was brutal. Men collapsed from sunstroke and were left where they fell. There was no time to stop, no wagons to spare for the dying. The column reached the outskirts of Esztergom in late August, and the siege began immediately. Too immediately, some said later. The trenches were dug in haste, the artillery positioned badly, the initial assaults launched before the engineers had properly surveyed the walls. Men died in those first attacks for no reason, except that their commanders were too impatient to wait. The Ottoman defenders, startled by the speed of the Christian approach, recovered quickly and made them pay for every foot of ground. By the time September arrived, the siege had settled into the grinding rhythm of attrition. Assault, repulse, bombardment, counter-bombardment, raid, counter-raid. The casualty list grew longer, the supply situation grew worse. and the coalition, that fragile, hateful coalition, began to crack. The first major crisis came on September 15th, when Hungarian scouts reported an Ottoman relief force moving north from Belgrade. 30,000 men, possibly more, under the command of Grand Vizier Sinan Pasha, the father of the man defending Esztergom. Father and son working in coordination, the father to crush the besiegers from without, the son to bleed them from within. Mansfeld called another council. This time no one argued. They simply stared at the map, at the red line marking the Ottoman advance, at the arithmetic that said they had perhaps 3 weeks before the relief force arrived. 3 weeks to take a fortress that had resisted for a month. The mine beneath the southeastern bastion was their only hope. If it worked, the walls would fall. If it failed, they would all die on that Hungarian hillside, and Vienna itself would be next. Mansfeld gave the order, accelerate everything. More powder for the mine, more assaults to keep the garrison distracted, more pressure, more blood, more bodies fed into the meat grinder of the trenches. The men did not cheer. They simply nodded and returned to their positions, understanding without being told that they had just been ordered to die faster. Some of them would succeed. The explosion came at dawn, and it came wrong. The mine beneath the southeastern bastion detonated 30 seconds early. Later, engineers would blame a slow-burning fuse that burned fast, or perhaps a spark from a lantern carried too close by a nervous sapper. The cause didn't matter. What mattered was that 200 German infantry were still in the approach trenches, waiting for the signal to charge, when 800 pounds of powder turned the world into sound and fury. The blast wave hit them like the hand of God. Men were lifted off their feet, thrown backward into the mud, eardrums burst, lungs compressed, ribs cracked. A sergeant named Heinrich Vogt, whose letters home would later be preserved in a Bavarian archive, described it as the end of all things, a noise that was not noise but the absence of everything that was not noise. He woke up 20 feet from where he had been standing, covered in dirt that smelled of sulphur and cooked meat, unable to hear anything except a high, thin ringing that would stay with him for the rest of his life. But the mine worked. The southeastern bastion simply ceased to exist. One moment it was there, 30 feet of Ottoman stonework, artillery emplacements, wooden platforms where Turkish musketeers had been taking their positions for the morning watch. The next moment it was a crater. Stone blocks the size of oxen rained down across the siege lines. A column of smoke and dust rose 500 feet into the air, visible from Vienna itself if anyone had been watching. The assault began before the dust settled. It had to. Every minute of delay was a minute for the Ottoman defenders to recover, to reposition, to fill the breach with whatever bodies they had left. Mansfeld's infantry charged forward through a landscape transformed. Trenches had become shallow graves. Packed earth had become loose rubble. The familiar approach route had become a moonscape of craters and debris. The first men into the breach were Hungarian hussars, dismounted, fighting on foot because horses could not navigate the rubble. They carried sabres and pistols and the burning fury of men retaking their homeland. They hit the Ottoman line while the defenders were still staggering, still deaf from the blast, still trying to understand what had happened to the world. For 20 minutes, it was slaughter. The Ottomans had no formation, no coordination, no coherent defence. Men fought individually, in small clusters, backs to walls that no longer existed. A Turkish officer, witnesses later identified him as one of Sinan Pasha's adjutants, tried to rally a group of janissaries near the mosque, but a Hungarian sabre took his head before he could finish his first sentence. The head bounced twice on the rubble and came to rest facing east toward Mecca, as if in final prayer. Historians still debate whether the garrison could have held if the mine had detonated on schedule. 30 seconds might have made no difference, or it might have allowed the defenders to reach their positions, to present a wall of musket fire that would have torn the assault apart. War is decided by margins like this. 30 seconds. A fuse that burned wrong. History pivoting on a spark. What is certain is that by noon, the Christians held the breach and the outer wall. Ottoman resistance had collapsed inward, the surviving defenders retreating to the inner citadel on the hill's peak. Sinan Pasha himself was wounded. A musket ball had grazed his shoulder, and he commanded from a chair, pale and bleeding, while his officers tried to organise what remained of the garrison. Victory. It tasted like copper in the mouth, like blood from a bitten tongue. Mansfeld received the reports in his command tent, face expressionless, and immediately began planning the next assault. There was no celebration. There was no time. The inner citadel was smaller but stronger, a core of stone and iron that the Ottomans had built specifically to survive the loss of the outer walls. Taking it would cost more than the breach had cost, and the relief force was still coming, still marching north, still drawing closer with every hour that passed. That night in the Christian camp, men drank and sang and told each other that the worst was over. The walls were broken, the Turks were beaten. A few more days, and Esztergom would be Christian again. In his tent, Mansfeld sat alone with the casualty reports. 400 dead in the assault, 300 wounded, of whom half would not survive the week. He had lost a quarter of his assault force, taking a position that would require twice as many men to hold. He poured himself wine, German wine shipped from the Rhineland, warm and sour after weeks in transit, and drank it without tasting. His hands, swollen with gout, trembled slightly as he set down the cup. The first real battle was over. The war for Esztergom had just begun, and somewhere in the darkness, beneath the rubble of the southeastern bastion, Turkish sappers were already digging. The earth moved at night. Soldiers sleeping in the forward trenches felt it first, a faint vibration, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat pulsing up through the packed dirt. Some dismissed it as imagination, the exhausted mind playing tricks after weeks of bombardment. Others lay awake, pressing their ears to the ground, trying to decode the message buried in that trembling. They were right to be afraid. Beneath the siege lines, a parallel war was being fought. Ottoman sappers had begun countermining within hours of the breach, digging tunnels from the inner citadel toward the Christian positions. Their goal was simple: burrow beneath the assault trenches, pack the tunnels with powder, and return the favour the Germans had given them. Turn the earth itself into a weapon, transform solid ground into sudden graves. The Ottoman mining crews were specialists, many of them recruited from the Balkans, where generations of men had learned to dig through rock in search of silver and copper. They worked in darkness, by feel, by the sound of their own breathing. Candles were forbidden. An open flame in a tunnel meant death if the air was bad. They navigated by rope and touch, carving passages barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, shoring up the walls with timbers stolen from collapsed buildings above. Their commander was a man named Yusuf, a converted Greek whose Christian name had been Georgios, and who had spent 20 years in Ottoman service. He had survived 7 sieges, 4 mine collapses, and 1 encounter with a Christian countermining party that had left him with a scar running from his left eye to his jaw. He did not speak about that encounter. His hands spoke for him. When the subject arose, they would begin to shake, and he would find somewhere else to be. The Christians knew the countermining was happening. They could not know where. Mansfeld ordered his own engineers to listen. Teams of men were stationed throughout the forward trenches, lying flat against the earth with brass bowls pressed to the ground. An old technique that amplified sound, turning the faint vibrations into something almost audible. When they heard digging, they marked the location. When the digging grew louder, they dug their own tunnel toward it. What happened when the tunnels met was too horrible for official reports. Historians still debate whether the engagement on October 3rd was the war's first underground battle, or simply the first one that anyone survived to describe. A German mining party broke through into an Ottoman tunnel somewhere beneath the rubble of the outer wall. For a moment, both sides froze. Christians staring at Turks, Turks staring at Christians, everyone illuminated by the single guttering candle the Germans had risked carrying. Then someone screamed, and the darkness became a slaughterhouse. There was no room to swing a sword. Men fought with knives, with tools, with their bare hands. A German sapper named Matthias Brenner. His account was recorded by a priest weeks later, as Brenner lay dying of infected wounds, described grappling with a Turkish miner whose face he never saw. "I found his throat," Brenner said. "I squeezed until he stopped moving. Then I realized my hands were wet, and I did not know if it was his blood or mine." In the darkness, there was no difference. The tunnel collapsed during the fighting. Whether deliberately or from the violence of the struggle, no one could say. 14 men were buried alive, 7 Christians, 7 Ottomans. Their bodies were never recovered. The tunnel was simply abandoned, sealed at both ends, left to become a grave that would lie forgotten beneath the streets of Esztergom for centuries. Above ground, the siege continued as if nothing had happened. Cannons fired, assaults were launched and repulsed. The rain returned, heavier than before, turning the trenches into rivers of mud and sewage. Men died of dysentery at a rate that exceeded combat casualties. Surgeons ran out of clean bandages and started reusing ones cut from the uniforms of the dead. Mansfeld received the report about the underground battle without visible reaction. He had stopped showing reactions weeks ago. His face had become a mask, his voice a monotone, his entire being compressed into the single imperative of taking the fortress before the relief army arrived. That army was now 10 days away, perhaps less. The scouts' reports were fragmentary, contradictory, coloured by fear and exhaustion. What was certain was this: Grand Vizier Sinan Pasha was coming, and he was bringing enough men to bury the Christian siege force in Turkish steel. 10 days. The inner citadel still held. The underground war continued without resolution, and every night the earth trembled with the sound of men digging toward each other in the dark. Some prayers are answered, some tunnels find their targets. The question was whose prayer would be answered first. The storm came on October 7th, and it did not stop for 6 days. Not rain, that word was too gentle, too ordinary for what fell from the sky over Esztergom. This was a biblical deluge, a drowning from above, water falling in sheets so thick that sentries on the walls could not see 30 feet in front of them. The Danube swelled until it broke its banks, flooding the Christian camp's northern edge. Men woke to find their tents underwater, their supplies floating away, their powder stocks reduced to useless black paste. The siege did not pause, it could not, but it transformed into something else entirely, a war against the weather itself, against the fundamental hostility of a world that seemed determined to kill everyone equally, Christian and Muslim alike. In the Ottoman citadel, the flooding was almost worse. The underground cisterns that provided drinking water overflowed, mixing with the sewage that had accumulated over months of siege. Men drank what they had to drink and paid the price within hours, doubled over, voiding themselves until they were too weak to stand. Sinan Pasha, his shoulder wound festering despite the surgeon's efforts, watched his garrison dissolve from within. He had 800 men still capable of fighting, perhaps 900 if he armed the walking wounded. The relief army was 6 days away. His father's messengers had managed to slip through the Christian lines with the news. 6 days. It might as well have been 6 years. But the Christians were dying too. That was the only comfort. The camp hospitals, if 3 rain-soaked tents could be called hospitals, overflowed with men whose bodies had simply given up. Dysentery, typhus, fever, trench foot that turned gangrenous, requiring amputations performed with sores that had not been properly cleaned since August. The screaming from those tents continued day and night, a chorus of agony that even the storm could not quite drown out. Mansfeld himself fell ill on October 9th. He had been inspecting the forward trenches when he collapsed, falling face first into the mud, unable to rise. His officers carried him back to the command tent and summoned the physicians, who diagnosed severe exhaustion complicated by his existing conditions. He needed rest, they said. He needed warmth and clean water and food that was not already rotting. He needed, in other words, things that did not exist in the siege camp. Historians still debate whether Mansfeld's illness was genuine or diplomatic, a way of stepping back from command without formally relinquishing it, allowing Count Palffy to take over the daily operations while Mansfeld preserved his authority for the final assault. What is certain is that for 3 days, the Hungarian Count commanded the siege, and for 3 days the Hungarian and German factions worked together with something approaching efficiency. It did not last. It could not last. The crisis came on October 11th, when Palffy ordered an assault on the citadel's southern gate without consulting the German artillery commanders. The attack was premature. The guns had not finished their bombardment, the breach was not wide enough, the supporting trenches were flooded and impassable. 400 Hungarian infantry charged into a killing ground, and 200 of them did not come back. The Germans blamed Hungarian impatience. The Hungarians blamed German treachery, claiming the artillery had deliberately held fire to let Hungarian soldiers die. In the aftermath, a German captain and a Hungarian lieutenant drew swords in the command tent. They were separated before blood was spilled, but the damage was done. That night Mansfeld rose from his sickbed. He was pale, shaking, barely able to stand without support. But he walked to the command tent, took his place at the head of the table, and spoke 3 sentences that witnesses would remember for years afterward. The relief army is 4 days away. The citadel will fall in too. Anyone who obstructs that objective will be shot. He did not specify which faction he was addressing. He did not need to. The rain continued. The dying continued. But the coalition held together, not through trust, not through common purpose, but through the shared understanding that the alternative was death for everyone. Outside the walls, in the Ottoman lines to the south, Grand Vizier Sinan Pasha was indeed 4 days away. His army numbered 35,000 men, fresh and rested, eager for the slaughter that awaited them. 4 days, the citadel still held, and the storm showed no sign of breaking. Before we see how this ends, understand one thing. Everyone in that siege camp knew that taking Esztergom might kill them. What none of them knew was that taking Esztergom would destroy them more completely than any Turkish sword ever could. Dawn on October 13th came without rain. Men emerged from their tents blinking at the pale sunlight like creatures who had forgotten what the sky looked like. The mud was still ankle deep, the trenches still half flooded, but the air had changed. Crisp, cold, carrying the first bite of the winter that would follow. It was assault weather. Everyone knew it. The Ottomans on the walls knew it too. Their movements quickened, their positions tightened, their eyes scanned the Christian lines with the focused intensity of men who understood that today would decide everything. Mansfeld had spent the night finalising his plan. The artillery, every gun the Christians possessed, nearly 40 pieces ranging from massive siege cannon to lighter field pieces, would concentrate fire on the citadel's western wall, where the engineers had identified a structural weakness. 2 hours of bombardment, then 3 simultaneous assaults. Germans through the breach, Hungarians around the southern flank, Italians providing covering fire from the captured outer works. Everything committed, nothing held back. If it worked, the citadel would fall before noon. If it failed, there would be no second attempt. The relief army would arrive tomorrow, and the Christians would be crushed between hammer and anvil. The bombardment began at 6 in the morning. 40 cannons speaking at once created a sound that transcended sound. A physical force that pressed against the chest, vibrated through the bones, turned the air itself into a weapon. Stone dust rose from the citadel in great clouds, obscuring the walls, making it impossible to tell whether the shots were finding their marks. Mansfeld watched through a spyglass, counting seconds between impacts, calculating trajectories, trying to read the fortress's destruction through a veil of smoke and debris. The wall cracked at 7:15. A section near the southwestern corner, perhaps 20 feet wide, simply gave way, sliding outward in a cascade of broken stone that buried the defenders beneath it. Through the smoke, Mansfeld could see the gap. Not large, not clean, but passable. Enough for men to climb through single file, enough to get a foothold inside the citadel. He gave the order. Trumpets sounded across the siege lines, and 10,000 men began to move. The assault was chaos from the first moment. The Germans reached the breach first, climbing over rubble that shifted and slid beneath their boots, hauling themselves upward, while Ottoman muskets cracked from positions on either side. Men fell, 1, 2, 10, 20, tumbling backward down the slope of debris, landing in heaps that the men behind them had to climb over. The breach became a funnel of death, narrowing every approach into a killing zone that the Ottomans had prepared with terrible efficiency. Historians still debate whether Sinan Pasha had anticipated exactly this scenario or whether his final defence was improvised genius. What is certain is that the defenders fought with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose. They had been besieged for 7 weeks. They had watched their comrades die of disease and starvation and wounds that festered in the rain. They knew that surrender meant death, not clean death, not honourable death, but the slow public execution that awaited Ottoman commanders who lost imperial fortresses. So they did not surrender. They held the breach with bodies and blades and the sheer, bloody-minded determination of the doomed. The fighting lasted 6 hours. 6 hours in which the breach became a slaughterhouse, a cramped space perhaps 30 feet wide where men killed and died in such proximity that the living could not fall. They were held upright by the press of bodies around them, dead men standing, still clutching weapons, still staring at enemies who had also ceased to breathe. A German officer named Johann von Weiler, his account survives in the Habsburg military archives, described the moment when he realized the breach had become impassable. The dead were stacked so deep that we could not climb over them. We were not fighting Turks anymore. We were fighting the mountain of corpses they had made of our own men. At noon, Mansfeld committed his reserve. 2,000 fresh troops, held back for exactly this moment, surged forward into the breach. They hit the exhausted Ottoman line like a wave hitting a sandcastle, overwhelming through sheer mass what skill and courage could no longer hold. Sinan Pasha was killed at 12:30. A Hungarian sabre caught him in the neck as he tried to rally his last defenders near the citadel's inner gate. He fell without a sound, bleeding out on stones that his father had promised to relieve. His body was found later, still in his armour, eyes open to a sky he could no longer see. By 2 in the afternoon, the citadel had fallen. Ottoman resistance collapsed, not gradually, but all at once, the surviving defenders throwing down weapons and crying for quarter they would not receive. The Christians had won. The cost was written in the bodies that choked the breach. 800 dead, twice that many wounded, nearly a third of the assault force gone in 6 hours. Mansfeld received the news in silence. Then he gave an order that would haunt the Habsburg conscience for generations. No prisoners. The killing began before the order finished echoing. Men who had spent 7 weeks drowning in mud and fear, and the constant proximity of death did not need encouragement. They needed permission. Mansfeld's 2 words, "no prisoners," unlocked something that had been building in the siege camp since August. A pressure of rage and terror and sheer, accumulated misery that now found its release in the Ottoman garrison. The defenders who had surrendered were the first to die. They stood in clusters throughout the fallen citadel, hands raised, weapons abandoned, eyes searching for the mercy that armies traditionally extended to brave enemies who had fought well and lost honourably. They found no mercy. They found German swords and Hungarian sabres and the screaming fury of men who had forgotten what mercy meant. A Turkish officer, his name is lost but his death was recorded by an Italian witness, tried to invoke the rules of war. He had surrendered, he shouted. He was entitled to ransom. He was a man of rank, of honour, of... The sabre stroke cut him off mid-sentence. His head rolled across the courtyard and came to rest against the feet of a Christian soldier who kicked it aside without looking down. The citadel became an abattoir. Ottoman soldiers fled through the narrow streets, seeking shelter in buildings that offered none. The Christians followed, kicking down doors, dragging men from hiding places, killing them in doorways and courtyards and the small interior rooms where they had hoped to find safety. A mosque that had once been a church, the Ottomans had converted it 60 years earlier, became a slaughter pit. Dozens of Turks had sought sanctuary there, believing perhaps that holy ground would protect them. It did not. The Christians killed them beneath the arches, in the prayer niches, on carpets that had been gifts from Sultan Suleiman himself. Historians still debate whether Mansfeld's order was calculated or emotional, a strategic decision to deny the approaching relief army any possibility of reinforcement, or the exhausted rage of a dying man who no longer cared about consequences. The distinction, for the men dying in the citadel, was academic. By nightfall, the Ottoman garrison had ceased to exist, not defeated, not captured, erased. The counting took 3 days. Christian burial details, working through the debris of the citadel, tallied the dead with the mechanical precision of Clark's totalling accounts. 1,600 Ottoman soldiers killed in the assault and its aftermath. 200 more who had died during the siege from disease and starvation. The garrison's original strength had been nearly 2,000 men. Of those 2,000, fewer than 100 survived. Men who had been captured before the no prisoners order, men who had hidden in cellars and cisterns and emerged only when the killing stopped, men who had simply been overlooked in the chaos. The survivors were eventually ransomed, exchanged for Christian prisoners held in Ottoman hands. It was a footnote to a massacre. The Christian army had won. They held Esztergom. The fortress that had anchored Ottoman control of northern Hungary for 62 years was once again in Habsburg hands. But the relief army was still coming. Grand Vizier Sinan Pasha, father of the commander who had died defending the walls, arrived on October 14th, 1 day too late. His scouts brought him the news as his army approached the fortress. His son was dead, the citadel had fallen, 35,000 men had marched for 3 weeks to relieve a garrison that no longer existed. The chroniclers who recorded Sinan Pasha's reaction differed on the details. Some said he wept. Some said he raged, demanding the heads of scouts and messengers as if killing them could undo the reality they reported. Some said he simply sat on his horse in silence, staring at the distant walls where Ottoman banners had flown that morning and Christian banners flew now. What is certain is that he did not attack. The citadel was too strong, the Christian position too well prepared, the cost of assault too high for an army that had already lost its objective. He withdrew southward, pulling his 35,000 men back toward Belgrade, leaving Esztergom to its new masters. The siege was over. The battle for the fortress had been won. And here's where it gets worse. Because taking Esztergom had united the Christian coalition, holding it would tear that coalition apart. The fortress was full of treasure. 62 years of Ottoman accumulation, gold and silver and gems and carpets and weapons and everything that a garrison of 2,000 men had gathered during 6 decades of occupation. That treasure had to be divided, and every faction wanted their share. The wolves had finished killing the Turks. Now they would turn on each other. The fighting over plunder began before the Ottoman blood had dried. German soldiers broke into the citadel's treasury on the night of October 13th, less than 6 hours after the last defender died. They found what centuries of chroniclers would describe in breathless detail. Chests of silver coins stamped with Arabic inscriptions, bolts of silk worth more than a year's wages, jewelled scimitars presented by sultans to favoured commanders, carpets that had adorned the tents of pashas. They began carrying it out immediately, loading sacks onto shoulders, filling pockets and pouches in the spaces beneath breastplates. By morning, the Hungarians discovered what was happening. By midday, they had stopped asking questions and started taking. What followed was not quite a battle. It was something worse, a collapse of discipline, a descent into the kind of chaos that transforms allies into enemies faster than any Turkish sword. Hungarian soldiers confronted German soldiers over a chest of coins. German soldiers confronted Italian soldiers over a stack of carpets. Italian soldiers confronted everyone over the artillery pieces they claimed the right to salvage. Knives were drawn. Shots were fired. Men who had stood shoulder to shoulder in the breach now faced each other with murder in their eyes. Mansfeld tried to restore order. He issued commands. He threatened executions. He dragged himself from his sickbed to personally intervene when a German captain and a Hungarian lieutenant came within seconds of killing each other over a jewelled dagger. No one listened. For 7 weeks these men had obeyed because they feared the Turks more than they feared their own commanders. Now the Turks were dead. The fear had nowhere to go except sideways, toward the nearest target, toward the nearest enemy. And in the chaos, atrocities occurred that would stain Habsburg memory for generations. Historians still debate whether the massacre of the Turkish wounded was organised or spontaneous. The Ottoman survivors in the makeshift hospital, perhaps 50 men, too injured to flee, too broken to fight, were killed on the morning of October 14th. Not by order, not for any strategic purpose, simply because a group of soldiers walked past the building, heard Turkish voices inside, and decided that no Turks should remain alive in Esztergom. The killing took less than an hour. When it was finished, the soldiers moved on, looking for more plunder, barely registering what they had done. The worst came 3 days later, when the coalition's fragile truce finally shattered. A Hungarian company had claimed a cache of Ottoman cannon, 12 pieces, bronze, worth a small fortune if melted down. A German company disputed the claim, insisting the guns had been captured by their men. The argument escalated. A Hungarian officer struck a German sergeant. The German drew his sword. Within minutes, 60 men were fighting in the courtyard of the citadel they had taken together, killing each other over metal that neither side had earned and neither side truly wanted. 9 men died, 17 more were wounded seriously enough to require evacuation, and still the looting continued. Mansfeld's response was brutal but ineffective. He ordered 3 soldiers hanged, 2 Germans and 1 Hungarian, chosen with careful political balance, and declared that all plunder would be collected and divided according to each nation's contribution to the siege. The order was ignored. The hangings changed nothing except to add 3 more bodies to a fortress already overflowing with corpses. By October 17th, the coalition existed in name only. German units refused to patrol with Hungarian units. Hungarian units refused to share supplies with German units. Italian units withdrew to their own encampment and refused to participate in anything that might require them to choose sides. The relief army had retreated. The Ottoman garrison was dead. Esztergom was Christian, and the army that had taken it was eating itself alive. Mansfeld watched it happen with the exhausted detachment of a man who had spent everything he had. His health had not recovered from the collapse in the trenches. His physicians told him, privately, that he might have weeks left to live. He did not share this information with his officers. There was no point. They had stopped listening to him anyway. The siege was over. The victory was complete. The battle is over. The real tragedy is just beginning. Because Vienna was watching. The Habsburg court was watching. And what they saw was not a triumph. It was a warning about what happened when the Empire's armies were left in the field too long, when discipline dissolved, when commanders lost control of men who had been pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. Someone would have to answer for what happened at Esztergom. That someone, they were already deciding, would be Karl von Mansfeld. The court messenger reached Esztergom on October 21st, 8 days after the citadel fell. He carried a letter sealed with the Habsburg eagle, addressed to Count Karl von Mansfeld, commander of imperial forces in Hungary. The letter's contents were polite in that particular way that court documents are polite when delivering poison. Congratulations on the victory, gratitude for his service, and a summons to Vienna to consult on future operations. Mansfeld read the letter in his tent, his swollen hands struggling to break the seal. He understood what it meant. Consultation was how the Habsburgs dismissed inconvenient commanders. They would bring him to Vienna, feed him praise, and then quietly reassign him to some administrative position where he could do no more damage to their plans or their reputation. The massacre, the plundering, the collapse of discipline, someone had already reported it all. The court knew everything. They always knew everything. He wrote his reply that evening. It was 3 sentences long. He would return to Vienna as commanded, he would answer whatever questions the council wished to ask, and he requested only that his men be paid what they were owed before the army disbanded. He sealed it with hands that trembled, not from fear but from the fever that had returned and would not leave. The army began dispersing the next day. It happened not through order but through exhaustion. Companies simply packing up and marching home, men drifting away singly and in small groups, the great coalition dissolving like ice in spring water. The Hungarians left first, retreating eastward toward their estates, taking with them whatever plunder they had managed to secure. The Italians followed, bound for their condottiero camps in the south. The Germans remained longest, held together by discipline and the promise of back pay that might never come. Historians still debate whether Mansfeld could have held the army together if he had chosen to fight the summons. Some argue that he still commanded enough loyalty to refuse Vienna's orders, to declare himself independent, perhaps even to march on the capital itself. Others point to his deteriorating health, his political isolation, the fact that his own officers had stopped following his commands even before the plunder crisis. What is certain is that he did not resist. He simply obeyed. The return journey to Vienna took 12 days. Mansfeld travelled by litter. He was too weak to ride, too feverish to walk more than a few steps without support. His entourage consisted of 17 men, a physician, a priest, 6 guards, and 9 officers who had served him long enough to feel obligated to see him home. They moved slowly, stopping frequently, watching their commander's condition worsen with each passing day. He arrived in Vienna on November 4th, 1595. The city was preparing for winter, market stalls packed away, streets quieter than they had been in summer, a thin frost covering the cobblestones each morning. Mansfeld was carried to his residence, a modest house near the Hofburg that he had purchased 20 years earlier and barely visited since. His servants, those who remained, those who had not found other employment during his years of campaigning, prepared a bed and waited for him to die. But the court was not finished with him. 3 days after his arrival, a delegation from Archduke Matthias visited his sick room. They brought more documents, requisitions for accounting of supplies consumed during the siege, inventories of plunder collected and distributed, casualty reports requiring his personal signature. They spoke to him with the elaborate courtesy of men addressing a corpse that had not yet stopped breathing. Mansfeld signed everything. He had no strength left to argue, no political capital left to spend, no allies left to call upon. The men who had fought beside him at Esztergom were scattered across the empire, back in their villages and estates, already forgetting the horrors they had witnessed and committed. The men who had stayed in Vienna, the courtiers, the bureaucrats, the palace warriors, who had never held a sword in anger, now controlled his legacy. They were already rewriting the story. The official account of the siege, drafted by imperial historians before the year ended, praised Mansfeld's generalship while carefully omitting any mention of the massacre, the plunder crisis, the near mutiny that had followed victory. It described a clean triumph: walls breached, citadel taken, enemy defeated, fortress secured, the kind of victory that looked good in dispatches and worse in memory. The men who had been there knew the truth, but the men who had been there were not writing the histories. Mansfeld lived through November. His condition stabilized briefly. The fever broke, the swelling in his joints subsided enough for him to walk again with assistance. He received visitors, answered questions, gave testimony to the military council about the siege's conduct. He told them what they wanted to hear. He had learned that skill long ago. What he thought during those final weeks no one recorded, but witnesses noted that he never spoke of Esztergom except when directly asked. And when asked, he answered in the shortest possible sentences, as if each word cost him something he could not afford to spend. The casualty reports arrived in Vienna throughout November, stack upon stack of paper bearing names that would never be spoken again. Imperial clerks compiled the numbers with the mechanical efficiency of men who processed such documents every day and would process more tomorrow. They worked in a cold stone chamber near the Hofburg's treasury, quills scratching across ledger pages, transforming human lives into arithmetic. 3,400 dead during the siege, 1,800 wounded, of whom approximately half would die before spring. 600 missing, a category that covered everything from desertion to burial beneath collapsed tunnels to bodies simply never recovered from the mud of the trenches. Nearly 6,000 men, gone. The numbers told only part of the story. The wounded who survived faced futures shaped by what the siege had done to them. Amputees unable to work, men blinded by musket flashes or infected wounds, men whose minds had broken somewhere in those 7 weeks and would never fully heal, who woke screaming from dreams of the breach, who flinched at sudden sounds, who could not look at Ottoman captives without reaching for weapons that had been taken away. The hospitals of Vienna and Pressburg and Prague filled with these broken survivors. The army had promised them pensions, care, honourable treatment. The army lied. The treasury was empty, drained by 2 years of continuous warfare. There was no money for the wounded. There was barely money for the fighting men who remained. Historians still debate whether the Habsburg court understood the true cost of Esztergom or simply chose not to. The siege had been expensive, not just in lives but in gold, in supplies, in the political capital required to hold the coalition together long enough to win. Taking the fortress had cost more than the fortress was worth. Holding it would cost more still, but the fortress had to be held. That was the strategic calculus that drove everything. Esztergom controlled the Danube crossing. Esztergom anchored the Hungarian frontier. Esztergom in Ottoman hands threatened Vienna itself. The Habsburgs had spent 6,000 men to take it. They would spend as many more to keep it. The garrison that replaced Mansfeld's shattered army arrived in December. 2,000 German and Hungarian soldiers, fresh from barracks in Austria and Bohemia, untouched by the siege that had broken their predecessors. They found a fortress that smelled of death and burned powder, walls still showing the scars of bombardment, streets still stained with blood that winter rains had not yet washed away. They found mass graves. The Ottoman dead had been buried eventually in trenches dug outside the citadel walls. 2,000 bodies, give or take, shoveled into pits that were too shallow and too crowded. The winter ground froze before the work was finished, leaving some of the dead partially exposed, faces visible through thin layers of earth. The new garrison learned to avoid certain areas of the fortress approaches, places where the smell was worst, where the frozen ground seemed to move in ways that suggested things beneath it that had not finished settling. The Christian dead had been treated with more care but not much more efficiency. A cemetery was consecrated near the Danube, and burial details worked for weeks to transfer bodies from where they had fallen to proper graves. Many bodies could not be identified. Many could not be moved. They had been buried by collapse, by mud, by the sheer weight of corpses piled atop them during the fighting. The cemetery filled quickly. Overflow graves were dug in fields nearby. Mansfeld did not see any of this. He remained in Vienna, confined to his house by illness, and by the unofficial house arrest that the court had imposed without ever formally acknowledging. He received the casualty reports. Someone made sure of that. Someone who wanted him to know exactly what his victory had cost. He read them all, every name, every number, every bureaucratic euphemism for death in all its forms. His health declined throughout December. The gout flared. His kidneys, damaged by years of campaign living, began to fail in earnest. His physicians prescribed rest and prayer and a diet of thin broth that he could barely keep down. They knew, and he knew, that they were simply waiting. The court continued its investigations. Questions about the massacre, questions about the plunder, questions about decisions made during the siege that could, in retrospect, be characterized as errors or worse. The military council was building a case, not for prosecution exactly, but for the quiet destruction of a reputation. Mansfeld would not be executed. He would simply be erased, his victory credited to others, his mistakes amplified until they were all that remained of his legacy. He understood what was happening. He was too exhausted to fight it. On December 23, 1595, 2 days before Christmas, Karl von Mansfeld dictated his last letter. It was addressed to no one in particular. His family was distant, his friends were dead or scattered, his allies had abandoned him. The letter simply stated that he had served the empire to the best of his ability and that he regretted nothing. It was a lie. But it was the kind of lie that dying men tell because the truth is too heavy to carry into whatever comes next. He signed it with a hand that could barely hold the quill. 3 weeks later, he was dead. Karl von Mansfeld died on January 14, 1596, in a bedroom overlooking a Vienna courtyard he had not visited in 20 years. The death was quiet. No drama, no last words preserved by hovering witnesses, no theatrical gasps or meaningful silences. His physician recorded simply that the Count's breathing became irregular shortly after midnight, continued for several hours, and then stopped. The body was removed the next morning, washed, dressed in the black velvet of Habsburg mourning, and placed in a coffin that had been prepared weeks in advance. The funeral was appropriately modest. Court officials attended, their presence was required, but they kept their eulogies brief and their praise generic. Karl von Mansfeld had served the empire. Karl von Mansfeld had won battles. Karl von Mansfeld was now with God. The ceremony lasted less than an hour. The burial took place in a family crypt in Lower Austria that he had never visited while alive and would occupy forever in death. Within a week, Vienna had moved on to other concerns. The long Turkish war continued. It would continue for another decade, grinding through fortress after fortress, army after army, leaving perhaps 300,000 dead across Hungary and the Balkans. Esztergom changed hands again. The Ottomans recaptured it in 1605, held it until 1683, lost it permanently only after the Great Turkish War that broke Ottoman power in Europe forever. The fortress that had cost 6,000 Christian lives in 1595 would cost thousands more before history was finished with it. Historians still debate whether the siege of Esztergom mattered at all in the long arc of Habsburg-Ottoman conflict. Some argue that it was a turning point, the first major Christian victory that proved the Ottoman tide could be reversed. Others contend that it was a Pyrrhic triumph, a victory that cost more than it gained and distracted the empire from more important objectives. The debate continues in academic journals and conference papers, footnoted and qualified and hedged with scholarly caution. What the historians rarely mention is what the siege did to the men who survived it. Count Miklos Palffy, the Hungarian commander who had nearly duelled Mansfeld over strategy, became one of the war's most celebrated heroes. He won battle after battle, captured fortress after fortress, earned titles and estates that made his family one of Hungary's most powerful. He died in 1600, at the siege of another fortress, killed by a Turkish musket ball that caught him in the throat while he was directing an assault. He was 48 years old. His body was transported to Hungary with full honours. His epitaph praised his courage and his service and said nothing about Esztergom. Sigismund Bathory, the Transylvanian prince whose forces had guarded the siege's southern flank, went mad. The word mad appears in contemporary accounts, not as metaphor but as diagnosis. He abdicated his throne 3 times, resumed it twice, became convinced that his servants were trying to poison him, and spent his final years in Prague as a pensioner of the Habsburg court, raving about enemies who existed only in his deteriorating mind. He died in 1613, forgotten, his principality long since absorbed by powers that had outlasted him. The soldiers who had fought in the breach, those who survived, those who made it home, those who lived long enough to have families and tell stories, did not speak of what they had seen. Their silence appears in the gaps of the historical record, the letters that mention the siege only in passing, the memoirs that skip from before to after, as if the 7 weeks between had never existed. They carried what they had done and what had been done to them into the rest of their lives, and they buried it there, deep enough that it would not surface until their dreams. The Ottoman garrison left no survivors to tell their story. 1,600 men who had held the walls, fought in the breach, died in the massacre that followed. Their voices were silenced in a single afternoon. Their names were recorded in Ottoman archives, sent back to Constantinople as lists of the dead, filed away in bureaucratic vaults that time and fire and neglect would eventually destroy. Of the men who defended Esztergom, almost nothing remains except the fact of their death. Sinan Pasha's body was never properly buried. It lay in the citadel courtyard for 3 days after the assault, stripped of its armour by looters, face exposed to the October sky. A Hungarian officer eventually ordered it interred somewhere. Accounts differ on the location, but no grave marker was ever placed, and no record survives of where the commander of Esztergom's defence finally came to rest. His father, Grand Vizier Sinan Pasha, retired from military command the following year. He died in 1596, less than 12 months after his son, reportedly of grief and exhaustion. The Ottoman chronicles describe him as a man who never recovered from the news that reached him on that October afternoon, that his army had arrived one day too late, that his son had died defending walls the father could not relieve. The fortress remained. That was what mattered to the empires that fought over it. Stone and mortar and strategic position. These things outlasted the men who bled for them. Esztergom stood on its hill above the Danube, walls repaired, garrison replaced, ready for the next siege and the siege after that. It was a piece on a board that emperors moved and counter-moved, valuable only for what it controlled, indifferent to the bodies stacked beneath its foundations. Karl von Mansfeld had taken the fortress. The empire he served remembered the victory and forgot the man. His name appears in military histories cited in footnotes, mentioned in passing as one of many commanders who fought in the Long Turkish War. The siege he conducted is described in paragraphs, sometimes pages, rarely more. The massacre that followed receives a sentence or two, acknowledged and then set aside. History remembers the walls, it forgets the screams. The empire endured, the man did not, and the story told afterward erased everything that mattered. The drowning men in the trenches, the sappers killing each other in darkness, the wounded begging for mercy they did not receive, the allies who became wolves, the commander who took the fortress and lost himself in the taking. They built monuments, they didn't build graves.